Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone, based on your time zone. Welcome in Salesforce Apex Hour. My name is Amit, and today we are going to talk about get high quality with the low cost with the DevOps Center and GitHub Action. And we have a two MVP speaker with me. So let Christian and Daniel. So let me hand over them for their introduction and presentation.
Thank you very much for having us, Amit. Yeah, let's start with quick intros. My name is Daniel. I'm a Salesforce MVP from Frankfurt in Germany. I'm a user group leader, and I'm a frequent speaker at community events and Dreamforce. And I started doing DevOps with no coders and coders for sure, but no coders are the important bits, are the important people because they typically don't practice DevOps for quite a long time, since 2017, I think. And it was quite a learning curve. Professionally, I do that as a CTO at the Interaktiven, an implementation partner in Germany. And if you would like to have be in touch with me, reach out to me on Twitter or LinkedIn. It's a joke between Sandor and I, or Sandor likes this joke particularly. I'm pretty active on Trailhead, and I have about 460,000 points. And this is the segue over to Sandor to show me his record.
Thank you so much. No, I will not be talking about my Trailhead record. My name is Sander. Hello and welcome, everyone. And just like Daniel, I'm active in the German community and been pursuing DevOps for more than 6 years now, 5 years for a product company. Recently, I joined an SI partner, coincidentally, the same SI partner Daniel works for. I'm now a technical evangelist Salesforce for the Interaktiven here in Germany. And if you want to listen my ramblings around Salesforce, then please follow me on Twitter. We start every session with saying thank you. And today, especially thank you for taking time out of your long weekend, should you be joining from Canada or the US. It's great that you take out time of your day to spend it on learning with Salesforce and us. And we prepared Alhopala, that was too fast, sorry for that. We prepared a lengthy agenda, but it will be a short while because a lot of that is storytelling. In the middle of it, we will be having a demo, of course. We will be starting by asking ourselves, how do we like reviewing change sets? And if you're not in the habit of reviewing change sets, then let me tell you already, it is perfectly technically possible and has been so for many, many years. But the question is, or the problem was that only a few people knew about that and only a few people practiced that. And DevOps Center, along with a version control system like GitHub, is closing the gap for people like so for people that are no coders. That is the important bit. Daniel mentioned it already. It is not about, wow, we can put metadata into GitHub, but it's about, wow, we finally can put admins and app builders into a repository-based change management process. And this is where we're situated today. We're talking about change management and how DevOps Center and GitHub Actions can help you to focus on important bits of change management and automate the rest away idly. So let me get started by asking the question, how do you like reviewing change sets, Daniel? How do you do that?
Well, I don't really like it because it's really hard for me to know what's actually in there, and it feels like, oh yeah, like yeah, that's really telling. I often feel like this detective.
Now the technical question, how can you review change sets? Am I supposed to click into every little bit of metadata? How is that supposed to work? You're an architect, you should know.
Yeah, and if you want a technical answer and the governance answer, you certainly should, because everything that's in there goes into your org and then affects what is in the org. Overall, the overall concept of that is quality, right?
Yes,
Things that come into your
absolutely.
org, and you should know what happens. Do you?
Well, I can add to the governance answer. I can add the technical answer. If I think about a change set in technical terms, then a change set is a package of
Yeah, right.
metadata, right? And there are two perspectives on metadata, generally speaking. And for everyone who doesn't know what metadata is, anytime you configure something in Salesforce, anytime you build a flow, you change something in Salesforce. And Salesforce remembers those changes, you save those changes, obviously, and Salesforce puts them in a particular format, into the so-called metadata format. And in the end of the day, metadata is used to produce data records in Salesforce, and we shape the processes, how those records can and will be created by configuring Salesforce, and by that, creating changes in metadata. Now, as Salesforce pros, you know, everything in Salesforce is somewhere a database table. So, and that is also true for metadata. For Salesforce, it's just data tables, and every click you do is saved somewhere in a row, and Salesforce then knows what to display you and how your automation works. Now, for us humans who work with metadata, a package of metadata is not lots of database stuff, but actually a collection of text files.
Mhm.
So if Ruth, the architect, wants to review a change set in the times before DevOps Center and in the times before we all moved to version control system, she was perfectly able to do so. So she could extract the change set and the contents of the change set, and she would
Okay.
have received a zip file. And from that zip file, she would have extracted texts. And this is where Git comes in, because if you work on a lot of text files and have a team that work basically on the same text file, let's for example, a Apex class or a flow, then you also know that if many people work on text files, the end result is often very confusing, chaotic, or full of errors. So back in the day, when Linux was invented, the inventor of Linux also invented Git, which is a way to manage changes in text files for very sophisticated operations. Let's put it that way. So there is a steep learning curve with Git if you really, really want to go into the weeds. But in the end of the day, Git just takes care of exactly that, managing changes in many, many text files. And a collection of those text files, be it code or be it metadata from Salesforce, is called a repository. And GitHub now is just a cloud service to host those text files and run Git operations on them. So on top, you get a UI, and the UI allows you, for example, to view changes. That is what GitHub calls a pull request. You can also edit files in the browser, a few other things. But the main idea is Git is the tool, and GitHub is a service by now owned by Microsoft. And what's important for us today is that GitHub and GitHub Actions in particular enable triggers. So triggers in the Salesforce term on individual files. So as soon as something changes on a file, you can run automation. That's the whole idea behind GitHub Actions. And even before GitHub Actions, Ruth and Cody, Ruth being the architect and Cody being the coder and developer, could have used GitHub or any other version control system to review stuff and get that into the repository, and then have a real look on what has changed and how is that changed. But as we all know, Salesforce is not only amazing because we can write pro code, but also because there are lots of no code user. And the question is, Daniel, how exactly do Astro and Flow, admin and app builder fit into the picture?
And that is extraordinary tough so far, because there's a big divide. Astro and Flow, and that's the way I started it, had to learn these kinds of tools to extract. Sandor said it so easily to pull the package, change that is a package technically, pull the package, put it in version control, and boom, there you go. But how? You had to learn the command line, and then it looked this way. This is something that you can teach, but it's a steep learning curve and really tedious if that's not your day-to-day business.
Now, DevOps Center addresses exactly that gap. It offers a friendly UI that is usable by developers, admins, and app builders alike, and the friendly UI lives within Salesforce,
Salesforce.
which is a great thing because we learned, and I also learned because I did basically the same steps as Daniel did for his company back then. I trained people on using VS Code, the CLI, pulling, pushing to GitHub in order to enable them to also work repository based. And the fact was that often enough I was supporting issues not around productive value add features in my product. I was discussing support cases of, oh, what does this error message mean?
Yeah.
Or how do I do that? Or, oh, I've written it down, but I think I made an error. So how exactly does it work again? So there was lots of support and people felt alienated. And although they did it open-heartedly, and yes, they understood it as part of the job, they better learn it, they never felt comfortable with it. And GitHub DevOps Center will try to address exactly that by allowing app builders and admins to work where they love to work, namely in an org. And they also allow developers to work where they love to work, namely often in an IDE and on their local machine. And DevOps Center thinks of both those. For today, we will be focusing mostly on the upper half of things. So the Astro and Flow side of things, especially in terms of GitHub Actions and how we can improve government decisions and enforce government decisions. But let me spend a few seconds on the picture here. So the Astro side of things and also the Kodi side of things begins with a work item in DevOps Center. And you will build always in your own org. You will then collect your changes and commit them even. And at a certain point in time, you say, I'm done with my work, let's have a review. And that is, as you will see, the demo part of DevOps Center. So the stages in DevOps Center are coming out of the box and are a strong, if not, so they're a strongness recommendation, and I'd say they're even a necessity. What I'm trying to say is the create review part of a step needs to be filled with life. Currently, it's just a technical thing by clicking there and clicking there, creating a pull request in GitHub. But if there's nothing happening on the review stage, if it's just click, click, and pass, then you will certainly lose the opportunity to improve your whole quality process, because reviews, in my personal view, are essential. And I'm not talking about only about the possibility to do automatic reviews. I'm certainly also talking about human reviews, so that we talk to each other in a team and find out how we want to shape things in our repository. So to summarize, DevOps Center, and this is also important for people who already know other tooling, professional solutions like Gearset, Copado, Flossum, AutoRabbit, you name them. please do not compare DevOps Center to them, because DevOps Center should be compared to change sets, and everything that DevOps Center improves, it improves upon the experience of using change sets so far. And I can tell you the experience is a great one in comparison to change sets. And in addition to that, what DevOps Center also does for you is give you a multi-tiered workflow, not only on the work item level, but also on the level of promoting changes. That means putting or deploying changes into the next org or production. And the next org is the important bit. DevOps Center requires you almost to use at least several stages to use several stages and to fill those stages again with live for your process, so that each stage can have certain checkboxes to tick off in order to ensure, again, your personal quality rules. DevOps Center is free, works with free licenses, and that's also important for larger projects. A DX limited access license is enough for people working on work items. Everyone who needs to promote / deploy changes needs a full CRM license. And as I also already explained, it comes with an assumed workflow, which we will be having a look at shortly. But before that, Daniel, I think, will give us a little bit more about GitHub Actions.
Yeah, and GitHub Actions, as Sandro said, are the things that are happen behind the scenes when you change something on files that are stored in your repository. And let's have a quick look at what it is and why they are even needed or useful. You can technically run them whenever something changes in version control. That is one idea to maintain quality gates on the things that are in your repository. You should at least run them when something goes into review, because we were talking about reviewing the content of a change set. Hence, the first thing we should look at is making parts of these reviews in a machine-readable way or in an automated way. And the first best thing we could think of is enforce some governance rules or best practices, and whatever kind of things we want to have in our org. For example, probably a naming convention for fields or some decision or guidelines that we have for flows. And why should we put these kind of rules into automatable tasks? That is because me as the architect or Cody as our developer reviewer is sick of reviewing all these things. And that is because the project is large and there's lots of things to read. And if you ever try to read a flow and understand the changes that have been made to this flow, you will find out that some of the metadata is probably not even human readable at all. It's machine readable because it builds a flow from that. But for Cody, hardly any chance to comprehend what's happening. So if you look at where we expand or enhance the stages that we in the workflow that we did before, we have Astro doing their changes, and then bringing back the changes into version control by the help of DevOps Center. And just as Astro commits these things to GitHub and creates opens the review, which is a pull request on the technical side, our GitHub Actions start to run and check something. And probably the best thing to give you an idea what these checks could look like, we should look into the product itself.
Whoopee! Demo time. I noticed there are a few questions in the audience. We will gladly address them at the end of the session. And no, this is not to put away with critical question. Yes, DevOps Center has rough edges currently, a few painful rough edges even, but the idea behind the whole thing is still to address the idea of a unified workflow between admins and admins, app builders, and developers. Now, if I open DevOps Center in my org, and have it set up, I will see it something like that. DevOps Center evolves around projects. And before we dive into a project, let's look at the involved environments, because these are the two essential parts of DevOps Center. The so-called pipeline, which we'll be having a look at now, consists of one or several developer orgs, which can be any kind of source tracked org. So it can be a scratch org, or could also be a sandbox. Please also notice the sync and up to date indicators here. The whole idea is that when you are done with some work, everything will move to the next stage, and in GitHub terms, it will move to another branch. And in order to avoid collisions that we know happen when people work from different sandboxes over a longer period of time, that it is very difficult in the end to integrate the changes. So DevOps Center encourages us to always sync from the next stage. In my case, it is integration, and start your work by making sure that your development org is up to date with everything that is currently being worked on. And if DevOps Center detects changes, then it will indicate so and also suggest you to sync. Outside of development environments, you have several orgs that represent stages. In our case, we have an integration stage. Why do we need an integration stage? Because people work on different things, might even touch the same thing. So we need to work out who has the best idea of touching the account field industry and its picklist values. And maybe we need discussion. And that's what I mean by integrating. I not only mean the technical part of their merge conflicts and something needs to happen, because that would happen in the review stage. I'm really talking about there are things that need to be discussed and integrated by manual work. From there, we go into a UAT sandbox. And from UAT sandbox, we go to staging. You also see that my orgs are on a specific kind of version. That is because DevOps Center allows us to create so-called bundles. Bundles are not packages. Bundles are just a term within DevOps Center, and they allow you to give an amount of work items telling name, and allow you to give a certain kind of release convention naming to the things you deploy to production if you want to. Nobody forces you to do bundles, so you can also move work items individually if you deactivate bundling. I was talking about work items. This is the work item view. As you see, I've closed a few already and a few are in progress. Let's talk about the workflow UI. And this is the part that is reachable with DX limited access licenses. So you see which org you are connected to. You see a change list, just like in Salesforce DX. And the idea is that you pull changes and add them and add a comment, which will end up as a commit in GitHub. Now, since this is an async process and takes a bit of time, and we all like fast and sexy demos, we will be giving the rest of the demo in slide format. If you know how DX works and if you used VS Code so far, then the changes list is what you would get for pull changes. But what's cool here is that you can select individual changes. So this is something that I'm envious. When I'm looking at DevOps Center, I said, yes, I would like to have something like that in VS Code, because I'm not always interested in pulling all the changes. And then, I can't delete the files, because deleting files will mean deleting also in the org, blah, blah. So I'm really happy that here I can just select what I'm interested in for this particular commit.
And why not check all and select all? Because obviously I changed this in the org, right?
Over time, you
Shouldn't.
will see several things happening. So depending on how long your sandbox is alive and how often you refreshed it, basically, you will, for example, see changes that no human did, but that Salesforce did. So also
Oh,
changes to profiles and permissions will show up in the changes list as changes by the automated process.
oh,
So going back to the change you, you can see in this case it's all last modified by me, but I've also seen in other environments that I have changes from automated process.
oh.
And what you cannot see, but what's also very important, is that what I see here is controlled by the force ignore file, which lives in the repository. I'm not demoing the repository today because the repository is just a plain boring repository. But fear not, would you like to try everything out that we show today? You can do so because everything is open source and everything can be followed up after in your own org. And talking about own orgs, DevOps Center works in developer orgs and in production orgs. You cannot install it in sandboxes or anywhere else. And also this bypassing DevOps Center currently is a managed package. So you will need to install it and do a little bit of setup, mainly connecting the orgs and thinking about your stage. And that ideally doesn't take longer than an hour if you know which stages to set up, and then you're already good to go. And it also offers a template repo if you don't want to use mine, for example. Okay, let's assume we have Astro and Astro wants to or has created a new account record page by either pulling changes, or what I also love is that you can add components manually. So if the change lists aren't up to date, or if I want to add something nonetheless because I want it into repo, then it's easy to add components manually. Now, Daniel, do you like the name of the record page?
Oh, this looks pretty good, doesn't it? I mean, it's the
Well,
account record page, right?
it is, and as soon as Astro moves his work item, as soon as Astro works their work item to review, they will notice that the
Oh,
promotion
why?
is blocked. Oh no, why? Because as I said, we have governance rules, and the governance rules
Ah,
are
oh,
enforced on the GitHub side. So when we go into GitHub Actions and look at the tests that we are running, then we also have some rules for miscellaneous metadata, and those obviously
oh.
fail for this commit or this
I
pull
think we were
request.
talking about this.
Yes, we were talking about this. We were talking about that we prefer that there are no underscores in record pages, for example.
Oh,
And that is why you should please go back and change the work item and commit a decent work record page name. And let
ah,
me quickly go back to the other slide. With any GitHub Teams account, you get 3,000 build minutes currently with GitHub Actions, which means that the local actions, so the things that we do not deploy and really run fast, do indeed run fast, which means those simple checks we see here, even on a larger code base, won't take a lot of your time and will not add additional costs necessarily to any team subscription on GitHub.
mm,
And yes, this is one of the ways that we can force admins to do our bidding in terms of governance, and that each time without a manual review. And that's the thing, because
mm.
reviewing 60 record pages for underscores is not a great task, is it? I mean, I don't like it. You probably don't like it either.
Yeah.
And the question around these things can be dealt with PMD. And the question now is, how about more complicated things? like a flow, for example. And let's imagine that flow now is working on a work item and is creating a new flow called update VIP status. And as you can imagine, what will happen?
It will certainly, it finds a lot of errors. What's
Yes,
going
because
on?
also for flows, we have strict naming conventions. So we want our people in our orgs and projects to build flows exactly the same way all of the time. Yes, it's a little bit of manual work in terms of assigning suffixes, but it saves a lot of time when you start reusing the elements in your flow, or converting things into subflows and bigger flows and smaller flows. Conventions are a big time saver, and makes me, for example, totally happy as a reviewer as well, because when I'm looking at the XML side of things, I get a better picture and can understand things quicker. And obviously, Flow, the character, needs to stick to stricter rules than maybe Astro as admin does, because Flow is indeed programming, visual programming, and you need to know about limits, you need to know about this, you need to know about that. And with, again, GitHub Actions, DevOps Center, and PMD, we can also put flow builders onto their spot in terms of naming convention, first of all, but also in terms of best practices, saying, for example, an action in a loop, which is something we should avoid. And this is also detectable by those combination of tools, because obviously, as you saw, we're using different things, right? We're using Jest, which executes JavaScript tests. We're using ESLint. We're using PMD, and also Prettier, because that is, and why Prettier? Prettier is not really a quality check, but developers use Prettier on their local machines. And if I don't make sure that my admins and app builders who are using only DevOps Center also get formatted code in the end, I will once again have more issues with the review, because I need to figure out what is just a formatting change and what is actually meant to be changed in terms of functionality.
So in a sacrilegious phrased in a sacrilegious way, you could go back to developer console and then commit almost clean code with that, right?
Yes, so cleanly formatted code at least,
At least,
or
at least.
even checked with PMD. Yes, so you can work. Full disclosure, I still like developer console. I open it every once in a while. I often use it for running queries. I even write code in there. But yes, in fact, if with people writing code in developer console and using change and until now using change sets, they can still write code in developer console. But with the DevOps Center, we know that this code will in the end look like the way we want it to look.
Yeah. And let me ask one more question.
Sure.
I remember that PMD has a lot of rules for Apex built in. How did the flow thing get in there? Because that is not default, right?
No, that is not default, but you can write your own rules in PMD. By now, and people following Robert Suseman maybe also know about, there's now a nice UI for working with PMD rules. So I can just put some code into a window and then try to match a selector in there. So yes, you can have a look at those rules in the repository. You'll get the link in the end of the session. They're basically XPath rules currently, because PMD can be used to check flows, because flows is XML, but PMD doesn't yet understand flow the same way as it understands Apex, because Apex, it can really follow through all paths, and for flow, it's manual thinking of rules and applying them. While these are pre-existing tools, which even come with pre-configuration, if you don't want to check flows, APMD will still check your Apex. The question then obviously comes up, where is the GitHub action part and how does that come in? And in the end of the day, all the quality checks that we saw can be set up with round about 11 lines of code, namely those you see in front of you. And as you also can see, that is the cool thing about GitHub Actions, I believe. You can reference different actions. So what the repo does, our DevOps repo does, is running an action that lives somewhere else, and that is important for people like our company, for example, as iPartner, who have many, many projects and hence many, many CI pipelines and configuration. And every once in a while, something needs updating. So for example, the SFDX CLI commands that we used a lot for many, many years are now being deprecated in favor of other commands.
SF commands.
Yes. So what we need to do now is go into a dozen or more repos and update the configuration manually and make sure that everything is working correctly again. Now, if you centralize CI like that or GitHub Actions like that, then you have one single place to change things, and that saves you a lot of work in the end of the day. If you want to get started, then you can use the repo here, DevOps Center template, and just fork it. And you can use any DevOps project to get your things running, and you will get the same checks that we saw on the demo slides. For production use, there should be different rules. So for production use, please understand what the tools do, like PMD and ESLint, how you configure them. You need to understand the moving parts of the DevOps Center demo we told you about today, because I was opinionated in some approaches, namely saying that some certain configuration files don't need to be part of the DevOps Center repo unless a developer puts it there, and until that, those config files need to be owned by our decentralized GitHub action. So there's an npm package involved, I'm saying. And you should learn a little bit about reusable GitHub action. And most importantly, when you use third-party stuff for CI, please make sure that you trust whatever you use, and idly make copies of whatever you use so that it's versioned and you can scrutinize it, analyze it, because in the end of the day, you give your code to a third party, right? And you will need to evaluate for yourselves if that is something you trust or not. Well,
So
please go on. Yes.
no, so you probably wondered, and we had some questions already. I think that will be a very lively discussion at the end.
Yes.
You might be wondering what is a good idea to do in DevOps Center and what's not. And we're going to share a bit of our experiences so far. We tried it with a semi-productive usage of that. And gathered some experiences, but you might want to add to that and share your ideas. The most important thing that Sander said is certainly the first thing that you might want to start, because it's an easy catch, is that governance and adherence to guidelines should be the number one target where you can really improve processes and make processes easier and faster. So start by finding your rules for governance. And if you don't want to start from scratch, we didn't, you probably didn't as well, then you can start by copy someone else's, for example, ours. But that's an opinionated task, and you should really spend some thinking time into that. And the next big thing to actually manage stuff in version control is you should consider moving to permission sets as far as it's possible at the moment, because breaking down permissioning into permission sets where you have a more modern and more modular metadata format already for permissioning, it makes it much easier to understand what changed And also it makes it much easier to safely deploy that stuff as compared to profiles, in particular standard profiles. Permission sets are the number one driver for successful adoption of CI workflows, I'd say, because these are some of the most complicated things, or profiles are some of the most complicated things to successfully deploy and maturely bring to the org. One thing that DevOps Center cannot do by default just now, or is it already? I think it is on the roadmap but not delivered yet. Each promotion should run the tests that you have in the org. By default, it is not required in sandboxes, and that opens a door for problems that you introduce by pushing changes. So what we added in our project is an action that runs that enforces the test runs for the target org, so that we understand if the deployment actually changes some or breaks something. The one question that I wanted to raise to Sander earlier, because in his demo org he had 2 projects for the same org. You can have or should have not just one product, not just one monolith, but you can use more than one project in the org. Our advice is to keep it as controllable as possible, so just a few projects. And the big trouble will start if you start sharing components between the projects that live in the same org. Then you certainly need to know what you're doing, and that's and then it is going to a more advanced side, and you should really think of a release management role to understand what's going on there. Sander already called out the big point of maintenance for the tooling in itself. The config for tooling should be centralized if you're using more than one repo. If someone it also introduces a kind of thinking to your to the way you manage things if you start modularizing and centralizing these things straight from the beginning. Some pain points. I think you suffered more than me, right? From the thing
Yes.
that one thing. Let's call it one thing. There were developers on the one slide, and the admins and the declarative people that work together in a peaceful and harmonic way. Our experiences are not exactly as peaceful, because if
we can boldly and blandly say, do not mix the workflows currently. So please do everything from DevOps Center, i.e. committing, because if a developer starts committing to GitHub directly, DevOps Center is supposed to pick up those changes, and it will eventually, but that can take up to 24 hours currently, and this is just a no-go. So if you want to have the happy path with DevOps Center, it is indeed the happy path with admins and app builders finally adding something to the repository. And another thing is, how do I start the repository? Where do I start the repository? That's also something that needs to be reflected upon, because if you start DevOps Center just like it is documented and intended, maybe even intended, you start with an empty repository. So you start at the time point X and you add your changes and your next changes. There is no full view. So there's no full production repository. I'm also not a big fan of a full production repository, but that's something for a different day or for the Q&A session. What I'm saying is you can start with an existing repository that will get deployed, but the idea behind DevOps Center is once again to give you a better option than change sets. And change sets also only ever deployed basically what you just recently changed and touched and added, right? So this is also one of the expectation management issues I was seeing.
Exactly. And I think the next point we have on the slide is exactly one of the things that points at this thing Sandor has been preaching. And if you heard me on the code live, I also phrased it that the word DevOps Center points in a direction that is not exactly fitting for what the product can do. It's more like enable people to use version control center, but that is probably not a fitting product name. What DevOps Center introduces as a capability on the platform is that you can do destructive changes and that you can take back changes that you promoted.
No, hang on. No, you can't unpromote changes yet. You can delete stuff, but you cannot unpromote.
You can revert. Oh, sorry. That was not precise. But you can start a Git revert through a click of a button, and it will also do destructive changes. And you can bring destructive changes to the next org with your deployment. But
yes,
that is a capability that is so far advanced of change sets, but it also comes with a but, because you can do destructive changes on things that cannot be deleted from the org, and this immediately breaks the deployment. So probably this will improve, and something that improves this is using a well-built gitignore file and forceignore, not gitignore. But when you try to promote destructive changes, then it needs some consideration on the things that you have in there, because you can run into deadlocks by trying to delete things from the org that cannot be deleted and deployed in conjunction with some things that you need to have there, which is then blocked. We all like customizing stuff, but customizing is currently not possible for you can create fields on the DevOps Center objects, yet as the user interface is custom built and component based, whatever fields you create on there, they just won't show in the user interface, just because but that, on the other hand, allows you to, for example, integrate with tools like Jira or so to get the work items there and store reference to data externally, but you won't see it in the user interface. And we also listed the proliferation of named credentials. That is basically because everybody, behind the scenes, it uses named credentials for every org and every user that uses the org. It's a per user credentialing, which leads to a long list of named credentials. And ever since it loses track of a named credential and something goes wrong or so, and if you re-authenticate, it does currently not delete the old named credentials that they saved. So it starts to look messy really fast, and in our demo org, it's just Sandor and me who did things. It's not exactly clean at the moment. Not sure if the team is working on that, but currently it looks a bit messy after a while.
Well, the team is quite busy at the moment. Fixing the prevalent issues like GitHub reflection takes too long, so all the quality of life issues you mentioned are being held back currently. The cool thing is that there is a public roadmap for DevOps Center. And one of the things that you just mentioned needs currently customizing, namely Jira integration, is something they're working on. Also, Bitbucket or different VCS changes. As you said, if you're strict about it, you could already integrate any tool you wanted via the usual means to create work items for you. And this is maybe also an important decision and consideration. Is DevOps Center a satellite for you? So meaning I have a workflow that works for me, and now finally I can add additional people, they work in DevOps Center, or is DevOps Center central for you? So meaning I haven't started yet working repository based, I want to start working repository based now, let's use DevOps Center. It will then be either your central system of records, or it will be just a satellite where everything else is handled in Jira or Agile Accelerator, for example. As we said, and I know maybe that we have some pro coders also, or pro CI and DevOps people in the audience. The starting point for us conceptually was orgs that still use change sets. and also orgs that maybe want Salesforce to solve an issue for them and not go for third-party vendors. And if you think from that, then DevOps Center is certainly one step in the right direction for the huge topic continuous integration. Because as soon as you have everyone on board, so admins, app builders, and coders, and they all push to the same repository, then you will be able to use the standard tools, Cumulus CI, Salesforce DX. I'm forgetting about the Accenture people right now.
DX at scale.
Yes, you can then decide which part of the repository after a time maybe should move into packaging. And obviously, if you ask me, if you have complicated projects, orgs, your ultimate goal should not be DevOps Center. Your ultimate goal should be packaging. And for that, you can use DevOps Center as an intermediary. But as you know, DevOps Center is not here for you to build packages. It's just here to allow people a better workflow than change sets with repositories. With GitHub Actions, you still can go the full flow or almost the full-blown flow, meaning that you can build to your liking governance as well as automation and quality controls. And if you look at it, then you have already a few checkboxes with DevOps Center in your pocket, always assuming that yesterday you used change sets, not assuming that you have already 23 unlocked packages and now DevOps Center will solve any of your issues. It will not. It will solve issues and will make the world better, I believe, for people working for change sets. And that's where we're also coming from with the projects we're doing with DevOps Center. These are people who have been using DevOps Center or change sets or have been doing for the last years full copy sandbox to production development.
Yes.
With no review in between, with, oh, I need to trust this partner and I need to trust this partner. And for these clients, I believe DevOps Center is certainly a way in the right direction. Before we go into QA, here's a slide with all the sources and also all the repositories that were used to create the experience today. And Daniel mentioned in briefing, we went live with DevOps Center in Alba a few weeks ago, I think, telling you about the general setup. So if you want to learn a little bit more about the general setup and workflow, you can also watch our session with Salesforce developers on Code Live. Okay, right. With that, we are into the Q&A round.
Let's probably start with reading from the from what came up as questions in the chat. One question that Scott has, and I think you can relate to that, is I heard stories of DevOps Center with DevOps Center that changes are stuck in commit pipelines and admins are unable to get those deployed. Any tips on troubleshooting and resolving these kind of issues with DevOps Center? What are you? How did you experience that?
First of all, please check the version you have installed in your org. Nominally, DevOps Center does push upgrades. They address the stalled commit pipeline in the recent bug fixes for June. That is DevOps Center version 5.77. That is maybe fixing the issue. The other thing is, and that is a sad truth, is obviously as soon as things get stuck in DevOps Center, admins and app builders cannot help themselves. And in our slides, we use Cody with the magnifying glasses as the people who does reviews. And the people who does the reviews can be some peer in your team, but it could and should be maybe also the release manager. And that is a role that is certainly central currently for DevOps Center. So I think you need someone who is knowledgeable with DX, metadata, Git, CLI, watching and sitting on the repo, because metadata are a complicated thing. DevOps Center pushes and pulls what you put in there. And as we all know, sometimes you need to know quite exactly what to put. into a specific change in order to make it deployable. Those issues will not go away. And Mitch Spano, hello Mitch, I love your work, thank you so much, says DevOps Center has many issues. Yes, it's a very early product and no lies about that.
Mm-hmm. One question was from Ankush is when we merge a branch outside of DevOps Center, work items get stuck. That is most likely the same thing that we were talking about when talking about the backsync. That is some issue, and we simply have to accept this for now while it's being worked on. We shared the resources to build custom GitHub actions, and Sandor built some of the things as an example. So you can look in the repo and you can look in the documentation that also Mitch shared. And in particular, we answered the question by just about the PMD rules in GitHub Actions. Sandor has the way to invoke PMD from GitHub Actions in the repo. Another thing is we need to replace metadata like reference of URLs of sandboxes on the deploy. That is something I think, Sandor, the same kind of action that runs the Apex test could theoretically invoke the string replacement that Mitch also mentioned in his comment on that. You could technically invoke the X commands again from a GitHub action. Or how did you run the tests for in the org, which is something that is comparable to that case?
Two questions right now, like how I do a replacement for a specific target org was one question.
Yep, exactly.
And GitHub action is just a runner for commands, basically.
Indeed.
And as soon as you know how to set up the file, you can basically run any sfdx CLI command. The sfdx CLI commands recently introduced metadata replacement commands. Cumulus CI has metadata replacement commands for ages. So the only thing that in context of DevOps Center is important is that those changes need to be committed.
Mm-hmm.
Because DevOps Center does the deployment. How does DevOps Center work, by the way? So you do something in your developer org and push the button, pull changes in DevOps Center. DevOps Center will first talk to a man in the middle who lives on Heroku, and that man in the middle will do all the power housing. So the man in the middle will connect to your dev org and will pull the changes and then display the changes into your production org. And the man in the middle is actually doing the deployments, and it will take the commit. So it tries to only deploy changes, really. So if you have a large repo and change just a small thing, not the whole large repo will deploy it, but only your recent change if everything works smoothly. Otherwise, everything will get deployed. But what I'm saying is, we would need to use something like a same commit action so that the commit would be amended, so that in my stages branch, like QA, I have the replace URLs. And when I made that, when I'm sure of that, then the man in the middle will pick up the right changes and deploy them to the org. And maybe also, I'm pretty sure that the important political message is please adopt DevOps Center, because if I personally fear, right? My personal fear is if we don't adopt DevOps Center, it will die and go away. And that would leave us only with change sets again. So I'm encouraging everyone to do at least a test install. But I'm also seeing that obviously URLs that need to be changed, things like that are not yet there, and the question is if they ever will be there, or if the product team will just say, well, this is something that needs to be dealt with on repo level, that needs to be dealt with this and that, because as you know, you can build and buy solutions for a lot of money that address those issues as well, and DevOps Center doesn't compete with those, full stop.
One thing I think that's outside of the scope that we can really deeply discuss, but Mitch raises the concern that DevOps Center doesn't populate branches in the way that the branch really reflects the sandbox as it is, which is something that is critical in terms of disaster recovery.
Well, once again, please be careful with the expectations you put towards your repo and DevOps Center.
Yeah.
The way it's currently built and intentioned is you start with an empty repo. You just add from now on everything you want there. Nobody thinks currently about disaster recovery, about rolling back changes, in massive scale. And what I want to say in defense is that we all work, and DevOps Center works with the metadata API. And we know if we try to do a disaster recovery manually, that it is a handful of work, if possible at all. And sometimes you need to make decisions. Okay, I can recover this, but I can't deploy that. So I need to do that manually. So once again, I'm repeating myself. Is it better than change sets? Yes. Is it a full-blown DevOps Center refactor, replace, and disaster recovery solution? No. Will it turn into that? I don't think so.
Yeah, I think the concern is, and that's something we probably should take time to discuss at Dreamforce. Had we had this question earlier, Mitch's assumption is that the difference in or the subset of metadata that is reflected in the repo as compared to what has gone through the pipeline even widens the gap between admin and developer actions, and that's some concern that is really worth discussing, but it's something that is way beyond the what DevOps Center intends to do. The name, as I said before, and that was a smirky remark, the name suggests something that is much bigger than what it actually can deliver. Christian has an interesting question about branch protection, because I and the things that I typically show and run don't have branch protection set up. Do you have experiences in that, Sandor?
I love branch protection rules because they are once again
yes, we all do. But
to enforce governance.
Did you run them in DevOps Center? Christian said. And it's been a problem for them in the past is to use branch protections and only allow merges into higher branches.
So in my tests, when a branch was protected, so required checks missing and anything like that, then I had the same icon like promotion blocked in DevOps Center. So if I required QA to have a manual check and also a manual reviewer plus certain checks to pass, I couldn't promote the item, and I was seeing the promotion blocked icon.
Okay, and the final question that I have on the list is the one that is something that you recently hit. So it's I'll read it out to you. If there are two projects sharing an integration org, for example, would changes deployed through one project show as out of sync in the second project?
Unfortunately, no. Changes are scoped currently to project as far as I found out, because I had not the very same situation. I'm having several projects working towards the same repository and working toward the same production work. And that is why I also stress that please, when you start a work item, click the sync button on your development org to make really, really sure that you get all projects changes into your developer org. That is an important manual step currently. The changes are not reflected, and my issue currently is that documentation wise, we have the bare minimum with DevOps Center currently. So for example, there is no documentation on how many repositories should I use, could I use, would I use, and for what reasons. And I'm certain the product team has ideas about that. And as I said, also the thing that the repo starts empty for DevOps Center is also an opinionated approach, and I'd love if those became more transparent in terms of this is how we did it and this is why we did it and these are our reasons.
Mm. And there's a question connected to that, because Christian assumes that could there be a way to use the GitHub actions to trigger a backsync of the other orgs? The interesting bit, and that could go in the direction that you were also already talking. We have a data model in Salesforce for DevOps Center, and everything is happening, or some of the parts are happening on the platform. Do you see any chance to either use this from GitHub Actions or to trigger a backsync from GitHub Actions, or even use the metadata for the DevOps Center that we have on the org, like
So if
writing
you're
an Apex trigger or so?
So if you're sophisticated enough to write a backend where GitHub Actions,
You're well beyond DevOps Center, obviously.
Yes, you're probably beyond DevOps Center. But
Yeah.
that doesn't mean their whole team is beyond DevOps Center. So
Yeah.
I was not really making the joke, because in the midway I realized, well, yeah, of course you might have the power, but still you have the issues with admins and app builders not adopting repo-based workflow.
Yeah.
In theory, as you said, everything is working through records. The records are scoped to a project. If I now were to clone those records into the other project as changes, or maybe, and if I were successful in that, I haven't tried, but in theory, if you were able to move the changes that exist as records and clone them to the other records, DevOps Center would tell you your dev org is up to date and would at least encourage you to sync. DevOps Center never forces the backsync. And I also think that a backsync should be a conscious decision, because it will or can be, so it can and maybe will override things that you're currently working on. So what you should do is have a look on what you would be backsyncing in order to avoid that you destroy somebody's work. Because, and yes, backsyncing, automatic backsyncing, and pulling all the branches into the open working branches, for that there are GitHub actions. So if you take that and say, hey, push all the things in my open feature branches, then as soon as the reflection issues are fixed, you'd be pretty safe there as well, because DevOps Center would pick up the changes made in GitHub via your GitHub action automation that distributes your QA stage to all open feature branches. By the way, also a feature that Cumulus CI brings out of the box. And I also know there are a few custom actions that do that on GitHub Actions. So because I see Scratch orgs now, I found that Scratch orgs need to be maintained, that over time the feature settings of the Scratch org in my repo do not match the feature settings of my org. So I need a whole process to keep my Scratch org definition in place with my production org. And since I have tried Hyperforce with sandbox cloning and source-tracked sandboxes, I'm not missing Scratch orgs too much, because I get a perfect clone of my production org in a decent time, and don't need to think about how do I extract the production features, how do I make sure that the things are deployable, and stuff like that. So my personal, I used to work as an ISV with Scratch orgs all of the time. Now with SIs, SI work and huge production orgs and lots of dependencies, I find it gets really expensive to maintain a Scratch org that is an accurate mirror of the things that happen in production.
The interesting one thing that Ankush brings up is backthink is irrelevant when there's only one dev org. Yes, it is for sure, because there shouldn't be changes promoting back from down the from the upper environments. It is something that should be considered when there are more than one dev orgs involved, because then it helps the process to propagate the changes that have been accepted to the other orgs. So
And
if there's
you-
one defog, you're really right, absolutely right. The process has been broken if you have to propagate changes back the line.
Be careful though, because DevOps Center supposes and presupposes that every team member who works on a work item has their own org. So if you do shared development in your org, and this is the reason why you have just one org, then be careful, because that will get very confusing very soon, because as soon as changes are submitted in DevOps Center, they will be removed from the changes list, and you won't be finding them anymore, and it will get very easy to overwrite things. So once again, please bring your own developer org for your own dev item. And ideally, as I said, if you're lucky enough to be on Hyperforce already and get quick sandbox cloning, getting a new development environment is a question of not hours and days anymore, but maybe half an hour.
And that's probably another thing that comes out as a result. Develop in isolation is a concept that is that a tool like DevOps Center helps to propagate to people, even though they're probably not developers by heart and nature.
All the workflows are opinionated, and I think they are a good fit if you think about the requirements from what CI is outside of the Salesforce industry and what Salesforce is technically with metadata, different orgs, stage developments. I'm happy for every decision they made. For example, making review central or making promoting items central. You might not like it that you cannot skip an item that is already promoted, meaning move to a new stage. But your review phase has failed fundamentally if you want to retract an item that late in the process. Now, obviously, there's always reasons, and Big Boss Man or Big Boss Woman might not like the color and the end result, so she pulls the plug. Okay, but from trying to embrace best practices, make sure that every item is reviewed thoroughly in the review stage so that you don't come in a situation where it needs to be removed. And even if it needs to be removed, well, nobody forces you to promote an item further. For now, it can just stick and rot in a specific stage. And obviously, there's always the way to go to GitHub, clean stuff out. We're not discussing this because we know as soon as you start doing this, you will now have issues because reflection will just kill your pipeline.
And with that, it's an apex hour and a quarter already. Are there any questions that we should answer here or should be raised immediately? Otherwise, there's the comment sections for the YouTube recording. And there's always the host to ping questions, and also the privilege of closing the session to Amit.